Welcome to FAVY Stories. Please subscribe, sit, and enjoy the beautiful show brought to your table. I still remember the day everything changed, like a bright balloon popping at a kid's party. One minute, we were living in this fancy house with a grand piano in the living room, even though none of us actually knew how to play it, and the next minute it was all gone. Dad's voice echoed in the hallway as he pleaded on the phone, desperation dripping from each word. I was just 17, standing by the window, and trying to pretend I wasn't shaking. Mom had passed away years before, so it had always been Dad, me, and my kid brother, Avery. We had a routine, a rhythm. Things weren't perfect, but we were comfortable. When I found out about Dad's debt, it felt like I'd just been dunked in ice water. The numbers made my head spin, and the realization sank in. We were broke, and not just a little broke. We were epically, massively broke. Dad had poured money into businesses that never took off, hoping to secure a solid future for us. Instead, we ended up with the bank knocking on our door. The day they seized our home was the day I realized fairy tales can crash in an instant. I remember Avery clinging to my waist as strangers walked through our house, tagging our furniture like vultures picking at scraps. He was only 10, wide-eyed with fear, and all I could think about was how I was supposed to fix this. My heart twisted every time he asked, "Where will we sleep tonight?" I looked at him, tears threatening to spill, and forced a brave face. Even at 17, I felt like I had to be a parent. Maybe I was scared out of my mind, but I vowed right then to protect him. I had no idea how, but I just couldn't let him down. It was so humiliating, walking up the porch steps of my aunt's house with a duffel bag in one hand and Avery holding the other. You'd think family would step up in a crisis, right? At least let you crash on the couch or something. But nope. Aunt Clara and Uncle Daniel seemed more concerned about how our sudden downfall might reflect on them than actually helping us. The moment we got there, it was like we were intruding on some fancy tea party. Aunt Clara kept fiddling with her pearl necklace, acting all shocked. She kept saying things like, "Oh, dear, this is just awful," but never once offered a spare bedroom or even a warm blanket. Uncle Daniel mostly stayed quiet, which somehow felt worse than Aunt Clara's fake sympathy. Even Avery sensed the tension. He started whimpering, and I tried to soothe him by explaining we were just visiting. But let's be real, we were practically begging for a place to stay. When I finally mustered the courage to say, "We don't have anywhere else to go," I noticed Uncle Daniel look down at his polished shoes like I'd asked him to donate a kidney. Aunt Clara's answer came out stiff as a frozen board. "We just don't have the space." Which was a total lie, by the way. Their house was huge. She talked about liability, about how they weren't prepared to support 2 more mouths to feed, and gave a quick speech about how we needed to learn to stand on our own 2 feet. I felt my cheeks burn hot with anger. We left with nothing but a hollow feeling in our chests. Avery kept asking, "Why won't they help us?" And I had to swallow the lump in my throat. At that moment, I told myself that no matter what, I'd find a way to take care of us, even if no one else would. After the shock wore off, the real grind started. I was this teenager who suddenly had to figure out how to pay rent, buy groceries, and basically keep Avery and me alive. People say you need work experience or a college degree to get a decent job, but I had neither. Before all this, my biggest worry was studying for finals or deciding which movie to watch on Saturday night. Now my worries got real. Every morning, I'd hit the streets, resume in hand, hope in heart, only to get turned down over and over. It was like no one believed I could handle anything more complex than fast food. And honestly, even the fast food places weren't calling me back. You'd be surprised how tough it is to land a minimum wage job when you've got 0 history in the workforce. My confidence took a huge beating with every rejection, and I had to keep smiling for Avery's sake. Couldn't let him see how scared I was. Eventually, I stumbled on a cleaning company that needed extra hands for a big contract. The lady who interviewed me must have seen the desperation in my eyes. She asked if I could start right away, and I nearly cried from relief. Sure, cleaning up after people in fancy offices wasn't glamorous, but it was a paycheck. It meant Avery could have 3 meals a day, and maybe we wouldn't have to crash in a friend's cramped apartment forever. I felt like I'd just won a small lottery. Of course, it was a steep step down from my old life. In high school, I wore designer jeans and complained about cafeteria food. Now, I wore a scratchy uniform and lugged around cleaning supplies. But at least it was a job, and I'd cling to that victory as long as I could. Walking into that towering glass building for my first day of work was pretty surreal. I remember thinking how Dad used to tell me about his business dealings in these high-rise offices, bragging about how he knew top executives by name. Now, here I was stepping into a polished lobby, but not as a guest or a client. I was the cleaning crew. It stung, but I tried to keep my head high. The supervisor handed me a bucket of supplies and showed me around. Everything was so shiny and new that I felt like I was tiptoeing on eggshells. My job was straightforward: empty trash cans, wipe down desks, vacuum corridors, and clean bathrooms. The bathrooms were the worst, not gonna lie, but I just told myself it was temporary. Around lunchtime, I saw these well-dressed office workers chatting with each other, carrying their fancy coffees, and going on about their weekend plans. I overheard a couple of them mention stock investments and global conferences, stuff I'd only heard Dad talk about back in the day. Part of me felt this wave of sadness, remembering how I used to dream of being in their shoes someday. But that was the old me, the girl who lived in a big house and didn't worry about money. I also noticed some people sneering or giving me those dismissive glances. One guy tossed his coffee cup on the floor right in front of me, expecting me to pick it up. My cheeks burned, but I forced a polite smile and cleaned it up. At that moment, something changed. My pride stung, sure, but a fire lit inside me. I told myself, this is just the beginning. One day, I'm gonna look back on this and realize it pushed me to become tougher. At least, that's what I hoped. I kept hearing his name in hushed tones. Noah Sinclair, the big boss, the CEO, the top guy who ran the entire operation. Most folks whispered about him like he was a myth. He's ruthless, or he doesn't tolerate mistakes, or he fired his own secretary for being 5 minutes late. The stories built him up into this larger-than-life figure who stalked the hallways in expensive suits. People basically acted like he was some kind of corporate boogeyman. Still, part of me was curious. I'd only seen him in passing once, and it was just a glimpse: tall, dark hair, wearing an expression that said, "I don't have time for nonsense." That was enough to confirm the rumors about him being serious and maybe a little scary. I heard someone in the break room say he'd inherited the company young after his parents passed, which made him all the more intriguing. But that wasn't any of my business. I was there to clean and get a paycheck, not to figure out the boss's life story. Even so, I noticed how some of the workers acted whenever they caught sight of him. They'd either shrink back like they were trying to become invisible or rush over to impress him. One of the office managers called him Mr. Sinclair in a voice dripping with both respect and fear. It was clear he demanded attention just by walking into a room. When I'd pass him in the hallway, which was rare, I'd lower my gaze and keep going. I didn't want to be on his radar. I wasn't looking to stir up trouble or make friends with the big shot. As far as I was concerned, the less he knew about me, the safer I'd be. After all, people said you didn't want to cross him. At home, well, it was more like a cramped apartment I shared with a friend of a friend. I spent my nights trying to balance what little money I earned. Most of it went to groceries, and the rest got stashed away for emergencies. Avery was usually quiet, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. He was just a kid who lost his room and his sense of stability. That tore at me more than anything else. One night, he started coughing like crazy. His face got flushed, and he complained his chest hurt. I freaked out because we didn't have health insurance. The last thing I wanted was a massive hospital bill. So I tried to do what Mom used to do: soothe him with warm soup and keep him propped up on pillows. But he just wasn't getting better, and I felt that rising panic. All I could think about was the life we had back in our old home. We had insurance. We had a pediatrician we trusted. We had the money to handle small health scares. Now, I was terrified that any slip-up could send us spiraling even further into debt. I felt guilty, like if I'd been more prepared or less naive, maybe we wouldn't be here. But that kind of thinking doesn't help when your brother is coughing his lungs out. Eventually, I called a local clinic, and they told me to bring him in. It turned out Avery just needed some medication, but it still cost more than I cared to admit. That meant I had to consider taking on extra cleaning shifts or maybe a second job. The stress felt like a constant weight on my shoulders. But if it kept Avery healthy, I'd do anything. No question. It was late, way past quitting time, when I heard it. I'd stayed behind to finish scrubbing the floor in one of the executive conference rooms, trying to score a little overtime. As I was heading to the supply closet, this faint sound reached my ears. Someone sobbing. You know how sometimes you hear crying and you're instantly on alert, wondering if someone's hurt or if you should mind your own business? Well, I couldn't just ignore it. I followed the sound to the stairwell, which was dim and kind of creepy at that hour. But the sobbing was definitely coming from behind the door. My first thought was maybe another cleaning person was having a meltdown. Life can be rough. I cracked the door open and saw a figure hunched on the steps. My heart started pounding. Should I just walk away? But I felt drawn in, needing to know if the person was okay. So I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it was him. Noah Sinclair, the notorious CEO, the one everyone called ruthless. His face was buried in his hands, and his shoulders shook with the kind of grief you don't often see in public. For a second, I couldn't move or breathe. It felt unreal, like I'd stumbled into a secret I wasn't meant to witness. My mind screamed, back away slowly, but my heart said, help him. There's something about seeing another person cry that reminds you we're all human. So I carefully approached. My stomach was in knots. I mean, he was my boss's boss's boss, but my concern outweighed my fear. I didn't know why he was crying, but at that moment, he looked so broken. And I knew all about feeling broken. I swear my heart was about to burst right out of my chest. I'd never been this close to him before, and here I was, creeping up like I was intruding on his most private moment. But he was so consumed by sadness that he didn't even notice me at first. Something about seeing this powerful man in tears made me forget all about social boundaries. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a worn handkerchief, one I'd kept from my dad, back when things were good. I bent down, gently touched his shoulder, and offered it to him. When he looked up, his eyes were red and wet, totally unguarded. For a split second, we just stared at each other. It felt like everything around us dissolved, and we were the only two people in the world. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I don't even think I said anything either. I just pressed the cloth into his hand. His fingers grazed mine, and something about that small contact made my skin tingle. My mind kept screaming, "He's your boss, don't do anything stupid." But my heart overrode all logic. I reached out and gently dabbed a tear off his cheek. I expected him to jerk away or snap at me, but he stayed frozen, like he was too shocked to react. Then, a single tear rolled down his face and landed on my hand. It felt intimate in a way I can't fully describe, like I was seeing a side of him no one else had ever seen. The moment felt both terrifying and oddly comforting. We shared a breath, then I stood up, placed the handkerchief beside him, and slipped away before words ruined that fragile connection. The whole thing was so surreal that I half expected to wake up the next morning and realize it was just a bizarre dream. But when I got to work the next day, I heard coworkers gossiping about the stairwell door being left open late last night. My heart pounded. Did someone see us? Did anyone spot me with him? I tried to keep my head down, hoping to blend in. One of the junior executives whispered to another that Mr. Sinclair seemed off today. More distracted, more quiet than usual. I felt this weird flutter in my stomach, wondering if maybe he was thinking about that moment we shared. I mean, it wasn't exactly normal to catch your boss in tears and then wipe them away. A couple of times, I thought I felt someone's gaze on me when I walked past the corner offices. But when I turned around, no one was there. My nerves were on edge all day. I was afraid he'd call me into his office and either fire me or, I don't know, demand I never speak of this again. Yet, hour after hour, nothing happened. As the week went on, I noticed he didn't cross my path even once. It was like he was avoiding me. Maybe he was embarrassed or worried I'd spread rumors. But what would I even say? Guess what, folks? Our CEO cries just like the rest of us. Yeah, that would go over well. I couldn't shake the thought of how broken he looked. In a strange way, it made me see him as a real human, not some untouchable big shot. I wanted to check on him, see if he was okay, but how could I? We weren't exactly on a buddy-buddy basis. So I stayed in the shadows, cleaning floors and emptying trash cans, carrying that secret moment around like a precious weight on my chest. Life in the office got a little weird after that night. People started noticing Noah, Mr. Sinclair, seemed, well, different. It wasn't like he began handing out candy or anything, but he was quieter, less cold. Some folks said his focus was shot. Others thought he was just brewing up a new plan for a major acquisition. The rumor mill went wild with theories, but no one guessed the truth. No one even suspected he might have been caught in a vulnerable moment. I kept my nose to the grindstone, double-checking each trash can and making sure the desks were spotless. But I couldn't help listening to the gossip. In one break room chat, a couple employees said they noticed the stairwell door was left open late that evening, and security found a discarded handkerchief. My heart hammered. That was my dad's old handkerchief. Did I leave it behind? I panicked a bit, thinking about how stupidly risky that was. If they connected that hanker back to me, would I lose my job? But then I thought, wait, it's not like it has my name stitched on it. So maybe I was overreacting. Still, the whole situation felt like a shaky tightrope walk. Employees started joking that Mr. Sinclair must have had a secret meeting, maybe with a high-profile client. Others whispered he had a mystery girlfriend or that he was plotting a huge corporate takeover. I just tried to act clueless whenever someone looked at me for a reaction. Meanwhile, a small part of me wondered what Noah was thinking. Did he remember me? Did he regret that I'd been there? Every time I saw him at a distance, he wore that same stern expression as always, yet there was a flicker in his eyes that looked haunted. Or maybe I was imagining things. Either way, the tension made it harder to breathe each time he was near. It was just another Tuesday, and I was lugging a cart of cleaning supplies through the lobby when everything went sideways, literally. I was rushing, trying to get to my next station before lunchtime traffic flooded in, and in my hurry, I took a corner too fast.
Bam!
I collided with a solid wall of a person. My cart went flying, and supplies scattered everywhere. Mops, rags, bottles of cleaning solution. The commotion echoed through the cavernous lobby, and I heard gasps from the people milling around. Flustered, I scrambled to grab the supplies before they rolled under the furniture. Then I looked up to stammer out an apology, and nearly had a heart attack. Standing right there, with an expression of surprise and maybe recognition, was Noah Sinclair. For a split second, we just stared at each other. I felt a wave of heat flood my cheeks. I couldn't form any words. My boss's boss was right in front of me, and I just crashed into him like a total klutz. People started to whisper. I could practically feel their stares drilling into the back of my head. Noah glanced around at the cluster of onlookers, then slowly crouched down to help me pick up the scattered supplies. It was so surreal. This man with a reputation for being ruthless was actually helping me gather up mops. The gossip level instantly skyrocketed. You could tell everyone was thinking, wait, since when does he help the cleaning staff? Once we'd corralled most of the mess, he straightened up. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I knew he recognized me from the stairwell. The look wasn't angry. It was something else. Relief? Curiosity? My heart was pounding like crazy, and I had no clue what to do next, with half the office watching our every move. I was still kneeling on the floor, my hands shaking from adrenaline and embarrassment, when Noah reached out. He gently took hold of my wrist, lifting my hand in front of everyone, like we were in some old-fashioned movie. Before I could process what was happening, he leaned down and pressed a soft, quick kiss to my knuckles. I heard gasps and hushed exclamations ripple through the crowd. Someone even dropped their coffee cup, and it clattered against the polished floor. My head felt like it was spinning. There was no logical reason for the CEO of this massive company to kiss my hand, especially not in front of half the staff. But there he was, staring at me with this quiet intensity. My cheeks flushed as if someone had turned a heat lamp on me. If there was a hole I could crawl into, I would have done it in a heartbeat. I tried to pull my hand away, stammering something about how sorry I was for bumping into him, but he just gave me this small, reassuring nod. It was like his eyes were saying, "It's okay," and for a moment I believed him. Then he turned to the stunned onlookers, calmly addressed them with a curt, "Everything's fine. Get back to work." Just like that, the spell was broken. People scattered like leaves in the wind, probably bursting with fresh gossip to share. I wanted to vanish too, but Noah took my elbow and guided me away from the center of the lobby, where the stairs burned the most. His touch was gentle, yet firm. My brain was flipping through 1,000 questions. Why did he do that? What's going on? But all I could do was follow him, heart racing, unsure if I was stepping into a dream or a nightmare. He led me into his office, which was all sleek lines and polished surfaces, like a page out of a luxury magazine. The minute the door clicked shut behind us, I felt my nerves spike. I mean, I was alone with the infamous CEO who'd just kissed my hand in front of everyone. This was a recipe for chaos. He gestured for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs. I perched on the edge, trying not to look as petrified as I felt. He walked around his massive desk but didn't sit. He just leaned against it, studying me. It was the first time I got a close-up look at him. He had shadows under his eyes, like he'd been losing sleep, and the tension in his shoulders gave away how stressed he might be. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice quiet. My heart nearly stopped. I managed to croak out, "For what?" He hesitated, clearly choosing his words. "For that night in the stairwell," he said. "You didn't have to do that." I felt my pulse in my ears. So, he did remember. I tried to shrug it off. "Anyone would have done the same," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Some people would have run the other way, but I didn't. And he hadn't forgotten. He asked my name, and I told him. My voice was shaky. He asked about my job, how long I'd been working for the cleaning company. I was careful with my answers, not wanting to overshare about my personal life. But I did mention I had a younger brother to support. He nodded, like he was filing that piece of information away. When he finally fell silent, the tension in the air felt electric. We both knew this was more than just a polite office chat. There was an unspoken link between us, and neither of us knew quite what to do with it. It happened so fast, it almost made my head spin. 1 second, we were awkwardly chatting about the stairwell, and the next, Noah dropped down on one knee right in front of me. My heart nearly catapulted out of my chest. My mind screamed, "What on earth is he doing?" He took my hand again, looking up at me with eyes so intense I had to remind myself to breathe. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, voice low and a bit raspy. The words seemed impossible, like they belonged to a scene in a romance novel, not my real life. But here we were. Part of me wanted to yank my hand away. This was insane. Noah was the CEO of a huge corporation, and I was a cleaning staffer. This power imbalance wasn't just a gap, it was the Grand Canyon. And yet, when he spoke, there was no arrogance in his tone. There was sincerity, almost desperation. My brain scrambled to make sense of it all. The hand kiss in the lobby, the intense stares, the memory of him crying alone in the stairwell. Could it be that in that fleeting moment of vulnerability, something clicked between us? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. But the look in his eyes made it seem so real. "I'm sorry if this is too fast," he admitted, still kneeling. "But I've never felt this way before. Tell me if I'm crossing a line, and I'll back off." His confession shook me to the core. I had a million reasons to say he was crossing every line there was. But my heart pounded in a traitorous rhythm, and part of me felt drawn to him. Still, fear took over. I pulled my hand away gently, my words tangling on my tongue. I need time," I managed. The intensity of his confession had me wanting to run straight out the door. I practically bolted from his office, my mind spinning like a top. Noah Sinclair, the guy everyone says is ruthless and unfeeling, just confessed he can't stop thinking about me. It felt like stepping into some alternate universe. My cheeks were still burning, and my heart thrummed in my chest like I'd just run a marathon. I knew I needed space, needed to breathe. The idea of being anywhere near him suddenly felt overwhelming. It wasn't that I hated the thought of him feeling something for me. It was more that it seemed completely crazy. He's got power, wealth, status, everything I used to have a taste of in my old life, though never on that scale. But I lost it all, and I've been scrubbing floors just to survive. How could I even entertain the idea of a relationship with him? Part of me was flattered. Who wouldn't be? He's good-looking, successful, and apparently has a heart beneath that cold exterior. But I also felt this gnawing fear. With someone like him, there's so much at stake. What if his interest is just a passing whim? What if he grows bored or decides I'm not worth the hassle? And then there's Avery. I've got to think about my brother, about giving him the stable life he deserves. If I dive into some office romance with my billionaire boss, it could all blow up in my face, leaving us worse off than before. I'd also be lying if I said I wasn't freaked out by the power imbalance. He basically owns the place where I work. All these thoughts tangled in my head like a mess of wires. I knew I couldn't ignore this. Noah was too persistent, and I wasn't quite sure how to handle it yet. But for now, my gut told me to keep my distance and figure out how I really felt before giving him any answer at all. That evening, I went home to find Avery curled up with his comic books. I plopped down next to him on the worn couch we shared in our friend's living room. He glanced up, noticing the stress etched on my face. We've always been close, so there's no hiding from him. He kept pressing me until I caved and told him the story. I tried to keep it vague, like, the CEO at work is acting weird, but Avery's eyes went wide the moment I mentioned Noah actually confessed some sort of affection. Avery's usually pretty quiet for a 12-year-old, but that night he unleashed a barrage of questions. Are you dating him? Is he nice to you? Does he know about us? I explained that I hadn't agreed to anything, that I was more freaked out than flattered. Avery got this thoughtful look on his face. He's still a kid, sure, but he's also grown up a lot since we lost everything. You gotta be careful, Dee, he said, crossing his arms. Guys like that can be tricky. Hearing him talk like an adult reminded me how much he's changed. He wasn't just worried about me dating a powerful man, he was worried about the bigger picture. What if Noah had ulterior motives? What if it was a game to him? Avery laid it all out, not because he wanted to scare me, but because he loves me and doesn't want to see me hurt. I pulled him into a hug, thankful for his honesty but also feeling torn. Part of me believed Noah wasn't just messing around. That night in the stairwell, he didn't act like a player. But I knew I had to keep my guard up. Avery was right. We couldn't afford another disaster. Not when we were barely hanging on. It's amazing how fast rumors spread in an office. By the time I went back to work the next day, practically everyone had heard some version of the lobby incident. Most of the stories were wild exaggerations. Some claimed Noah lifted me into his arms for a dramatic kiss. Others whispered that I'd seduced him to climb the corporate ladder. Every time I walked by a group of coworkers, they'd either go silent or toss me dirty looks. In the break room, one woman openly sneered when I came in to grab coffee. She muttered something under her breath about gold diggers. I felt my blood boil, but I managed to keep my mouth shut. Getting into a confrontation wouldn't help. If anything, it'd just fuel the gossip. So I tried to act unbothered, but inside, I was freaking out. I started questioning everything. Should I even keep working here? But I needed the paycheck. Should I confront them? That'd probably just make me look guiltier. Meanwhile, I had no clue where Noah stood on all this. Ever since that day, he'd stayed mostly in his office. We hadn't had another face-to-face meeting, but I'd catch glimpses of him in the hallway. He'd give me this soft, almost apologetic look, but I'd usually duck away or pretend to be busy. I just couldn't handle the tension, and the incessant stares from everyone around us didn't help either. It got so bad that one afternoon, a couple of my co-workers snickered as I passed by, saying, "Guess you'll be the next Mrs. Sinclair soon." The words stung because they implied I was just in it for money. They had no idea how complicated things really were. I wanted to scream. I never asked for his attention. But I stayed quiet. Sometimes, there's just no point in arguing when people have already made up their minds. Oddly enough, It was one of my fellow cleaners, an older lady named Ramona, who clued me in about Noah's past. We were wiping down the cafeteria tables late one evening, and she mentioned she'd been with the company for a long time, even before Noah took over. I must have looked curious because she leaned in and whispered, "You know, his parents died when he was young." That snippet of info hung in the air between us. I'd suspected something like that but hadn't been certain. Ramona went on to explain how there was a tragic fire and Noah was sent to live with his grandparents. They were the real powers behind the Sinclair business empire back then. He was just a teenager when he lost everything familiar. Hearing this sent a jolt through me. In a way, it mirrored what Avery and I had gone through. We might not have lost our parents the same way, but we lost our sense of security, our home, and the life we knew. Maybe that's why he'd broken down in the stairwell. Maybe it was an anniversary of that fire or something equally painful. Ramona, bless her heart, told me he used to be a kinder soul before tragedy hardened him. She guessed that losing so much so soon made him put up walls, adopt this ruthless persona just to survive in the business world. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces started making sense. No wonder he'd seemed so raw that night in the stairwell. I felt a tug of empathy. He wasn't just some emotionless CEO. He was a guy who'd been broken by loss, just like me in some ways. The more I thought about it, the more I realized we weren't so different after all. And that scared me, because the pull I felt toward him grew stronger with every new thing I learned. The next time I encountered Noah, it was different. He wasn't coming on strong or trying to corner me. Instead, he approached quietly while I was cleaning the windows near the executive suite. He asked if we could talk, and for once, there was no one around to gawk at us. He started by apologizing for causing a stir in the lobby, saying he hadn't meant to put me on the spot. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. He even offered to step in if anyone was harassing me because of the rumors. But I wasn't sure how I felt about him swooping in to defend me. It's not that I didn't appreciate the gesture. I just wanted to handle it myself. Then, he did something unexpected. He told me he'd arranged a more convenient appointment for Avery's next checkup at a better clinic. I froze, both touched and alarmed. Touched because it showed he'd paid attention to my life. Alarmed because I was worried there'd be a catch, like I'd owe him something. That's how the world works, right? People don't just do nice things for free. I asked him point blank, "What do you want from me?" He didn't flinch. He said he just wanted the chance to show me he was genuine, that he wasn't playing around. He explained that he knew what it felt like to lose people, to not have anyone to lean on. He wanted to be there for us, even if I wasn't ready to dive into anything romantic. Part of me believed him. Another part was screaming, "Don't let him get too close." But I couldn't ignore the glimmer of hope in his eyes. It seemed like he truly cared. So I nodded slowly, telling him I'd think about it. He didn't push, he just smiled, like even that small step made him happy. Despite his offers of help and the warmth I felt during our conversation, something in me still held back. So I kept my distance as much as I could. I avoided the break room during his usual coffee run, made sure to clean the top floor when I knew he was on the ground floor, and generally tried to keep our interactions brief.
Why?
Because even though my heart skipped a beat whenever he smiled at me, I was scared. Scared of losing my independence, scared of what people would say if I got closer to him, and most of all, scared that I'd rely on him and then he'd leave. I'd already watched my world crumble once, and I wasn't keen on going through that heartbreak again. But the distance was hard on both of us. I'd catch a glimpse of his face sometimes. He looked worried or hurt. A couple times, our eyes locked across the hallway, and it felt like a silent tug of war. One night, I overheard some employees joking that Noah was in a mood lately, that his temper was flaring more than usual. I blamed myself a little. Maybe pushing him away was messing with his head. He tried to text me. Yes, he managed to get my number somehow, but I rarely replied. A short thank you here or there if he did something kind, like sending a gift basket when Avery had a fever. But overall, I kept up a wall. At night, though, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I'd recall the way his eyes softened when I wiped away his tears, the gentle way he apologized for the lobby fiasco, and the sincerity in his voice when he said he just wanted to be there for me. That silent longing was growing, and I wasn't sure how long I could resist it. One afternoon, I was going about my usual cleaning routine when a senior manager, a man named Mr. Bellamy, stopped me in the hall. I'd seen him around, always in sharp suits, but never talked to him before. He asked if I had a minute to chat, and I braced myself, thinking he might scold me for the lobby fiasco or spread more gossip. But Mr. Bellamy surprised me by mentioning he'd known my father. He recalled my dad's name from some old business deals. My eyes widened. I hadn't realized anyone in this building remembered who my family used to be. He gave me a sympathetic smile and said, "Your dad had a good heart. It's a shame how things turned out." He went on to say that he'd pieced together who I was after hearing the rumors. He actually admired that I was working so hard, taking on cleaning duties to support my brother. I felt a flood of relief. Finally, someone who didn't judge me or think I was just a gold digger. Then Mr. Bellamy said something that stuck with me. "Noah's a good kid underneath it all, you know. He's been through hell, but he's got a heart. If he's reached out to you, it's probably for real." The way he spoke sounded more fatherly than managerial. It was like he was giving me permission to trust Noah, or at least not shut him out completely. I thanked him, my mind reeling. It felt odd to have someone in upper management acknowledge my struggles without sneering or pity. And it made me realize, if even a seasoned manager could see that Noah and I had some kind of connection, maybe I wasn't imagining it. Maybe I wasn't setting myself up for disaster. For the first time in a while, I felt just a little more sure about giving Noah a chance to prove himself. A few days later, I was scrubbing down the big conference room windows when my phone buzzed nonstop in my pocket. Annoyed at first, I fished it out to see that it was Avery's friend calling. My stomach did a flip. Why would he call me unless something was wrong? Sure enough, Avery had collapsed at school. Apparently, he'd been feeling sick, but tried to tough it out. They were rushing him to the hospital. My entire world went into panic mode. I dropped everything, literally left my mop and bucket right where they were, and sprinted out of the building. My heart hammered the whole taxi ride to the hospital. All I could think about was that I didn't have enough money for a huge medical bill. What if Avery needed serious treatment? My mind flipped through worst-case scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. By the time I got there, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely fill out the admission forms. To my surprise, Noah showed up not long after. One of the supervisors must have told him. I ran out in a panic. He looked genuinely worried, asking if Avery was okay, if I needed anything. It was strange, seeing him in this chaotic hospital setting instead of a sleek boardroom. But I was too stressed to care about appearances. Turns out Avery had a pretty severe relapse of an old respiratory issue. The doctors said he'd need close monitoring, possibly an overnight stay. I felt my stomach knotting with dread at the thought of the bill. Then Noah spoke up, saying he'd handle the costs. Normally, I would have refused, but this was Avery we were talking about. My pride wasn't worth risking my brother's health. So I thanked him, tears in my eyes, feeling more grateful and more vulnerable than ever before. While Avery slept off his fever in the hospital room, Noah and I ended up in the hallway, perched on plastic chairs next to a vending machine that hummed quietly. It was late, and the hospital was eerily calm. My emotions were still high, and for once, I let my walls down. I told him everything about Dad's debts, losing our home, the humiliation of getting rejected by our relatives, and the constant worry that I'd fail Avery. Words spilled out like a broken dam. I expected him to judge me, maybe pity me, but instead, he listened intently, his brow creasing with empathy. It felt strangely comforting to share my burdens, like unloading a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for too long. And when I finished, there was this moment of silence. Noah reached out and gently took my hand, giving it a light squeeze. "You've been through so much," he murmured. "You shouldn't have had to face all that alone." I wanted to brush off his concern, say something like, "I'm fine," but I knew that was a lie. I wasn't fine. I was scared, drained, and overwhelmed. Letting him see that vulnerability made me feel naked, but also oddly safe. He began to open up too. He told me about losing his parents in that fire and how he felt like he had to become stone cold just to survive in the world of corporate sharks. His grandparents loved him, but also pressured him to be perfect. Nobody let him grieve properly. Hearing him talk about that showed me we had more in common than I realized. By the end of that conversation, I felt this bond forming, a sense that we weren't just two employees in a big company, but two souls who understood each other's pain. And that, more than anything, gave me hope. Avery started improving by the next morning, which was a huge relief. The doctors said he'd need plenty of rest and follow-up care, but at least he was stable. Noah and I stayed by his bedside, trading stories to keep Avery's spirits up. It was surreal, seeing my formidable boss joking with my kid brother about silly video games. But somehow it felt right. When Noah stepped out to take a phone call, Avery grinned at me. "He's not as bad as you thought," he teased, clearly amused that I'd been so suspicious. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't hide my smile. Avery noticed that too and said, "You like him, don't you?" I shushed him, my cheeks warming, but I couldn't deny it. After the scare we'd just gone through, my defenses were lower. I saw Noah in a different light, someone who'd been through his own type of tragedy and still managed to claw his way up. That kind of resilience was something I respected, something that resonated with me. It didn't hurt that he was there for me when I needed it most, no questions asked. Later, Noah came back in and we talked about the future. About Avery's treatments, about how I'd been juggling so many responsibilities. He offered to help again, and this time I didn't immediately push him away. Instead, I told him I needed to do this carefully, my own way, and he nodded in understanding. It felt like a meeting of kindred spirits, two people who'd lost so much and were trying to rebuild in a hostile world. For the first time in a long while, I felt that maybe I wasn't alone. And from the look in Noah's eyes, he felt the same. Maybe this was the start of something deeper than just gratitude or fleeting attraction. Just as things started looking up personally, the outside world decided to rear its ugly head. News of our closeness spread like wildfire, especially after the hospital visit. I don't know who blabbed first, but within days, the rumor mill at work turned downright vicious. People started calling me all sorts of names behind my back, implying I was climbing the corporate ladder by dating the boss. But worse than that, some board members got wind of it. Apparently, they weren't thrilled that their CEO was getting mixed up with a low-level employee. They worried it would reflect badly on the company, that it might seem like nepotism or a scandal waiting to happen. Suddenly, Noah was faced with complaints and criticisms about his personal conduct. I'd see him around the office, tense lines marking his face, his jaw set in a grim expression. He'd try to shield me from the backlash, but I wasn't deaf. I heard the whispers. Some folks even tried to corner me with loaded questions like, "Don't you think you're overstepping your boundaries?" Or, "Isn't it inappropriate to date the CEO?" It stung. I wanted to scream back that I never asked for his attention, that I wasn't some scheming opportunist. But I kept my mouth shut because I didn't want to make waves or hurt Noah's reputation any more than I supposedly already had. One day, as I was wiping down a conference table, I overheard a heated conversation in the hallway. A pair of executives were debating whether they should push Noah to step down if he wouldn't end things with me. My heart froze. I realized this was bigger than just office gossip. This was a power struggle that could jeopardize Noah's position. And by extension, my job security as well. Life had never felt more complicated. Turns out the board members weren't the only ones frowning on our relationship. Noah's grandparents, who still held major sway in the company, stepped in. They were old money aristocrats who believed in image above all else. A relationship between their influential grandson and a cleaning staffer, someone with a troubled financial history, no less, was like a public relations nightmare to them. Noah got summoned to a private family meeting, which he described to me afterward as a barrage of criticisms and threats. They told him flat out that if he continued seeing me, they might cut him off from his inheritance, effectively crippling his ability to run the company. They claimed it was for his own good, that he needed to protect the Sinclair name. When he told me all this later, I felt a cold fear settle in my stomach. The last thing I wanted was to cause a rift in someone else's family. I knew how family could be, how the pressure and expectations could weigh you down. Part of me thought about just walking away, telling him I wasn't worth this chaos. But he shook his head and refused to let me shoulder that blame. He said, "They've never really approved of anything that doesn't align with their narrow view. This has been a long time coming." I could see the pain in his eyes, the heartbreak of having to choose between family and someone he cared about. That night, I lay awake, turning it all over in my head. Could I step aside so he wouldn't lose everything? But then I remembered the tender moments we'd shared, the way he'd looked after Avery. Could I really walk away from that? My emotions wrestled with my logic, and I knew a confrontation with his grandparents might be inevitable. It felt like our fragile happiness was teetering on the edge of a cliff. One evening, as we sat in the small living room of my makeshift apartment, Noah and I finally had a heart-to-heart without any interruptions or prying eyes. Avery was asleep, so it was just us and the hum of the old fridge in the background. Noah looked worn out but determined. He reached for my hand and asked me point-blank, "What are you most afraid of?" I was taken aback. Nobody really asks that question so directly. But I answered honestly, losing everything again, getting hurt, and dragging Avery through more chaos. My voice trembled, and I felt tears threaten to spill. Noah squeezed my hand gently and leaned in. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But life's already shown us it can rip away everything in an instant. If we let fear dictate our choices, we'll never hold on to anything good." His words hit me hard. Here was a man who had lost his parents, faced insane pressure from his family, and still chose to open his heart to me. I realized that despite all the drama and the gossip, what I felt for him was real, and it was growing stronger every day. We stayed up late, talking about everything from our favorite childhood memories to the dreams we once had. It was like peeling back layers of armor neither of us knew we were wearing. And when he finally leaned in and pressed his forehead to mine, whispering that he was falling in love, I felt something inside me melt. I told him I was scared, but I also couldn't deny my own feelings anymore. We clung to each other in that tiny, shabby living room, forging a pact to face whatever came next, side by side. It might not have been a fairy tale setting, but in that moment, it was perfect. Just when I thought we'd found a fragile piece, chaos hit again. A few jealous colleagues, ones who'd been spouting nasty rumors about me, cooked up a scheme to frame me for theft. They planted expensive office supplies and even some petty cash in my locker, then tipped off HR. Next thing I knew, I was being hauled into a meeting, accused of stealing from the company. My heart pounded as the HR rep laid out the evidence. It looked bad, really bad. Security had pictures, logs, everything. Tears stung my eyes as I protested my innocence, but the suspicious glares told me nobody believed me. Nobody except, as it turned out, Noah. The minute he heard about the accusations, he stormed into that meeting and demanded to see all the so-called proof. It was intense. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Noah glared at the HR manager and the security team, insisting there must be some mistake. Meanwhile, the rumor mill went into overdrive. People whispered that I'd finally been caught, that I was exactly who they thought I was, a gold digger and a thief. I felt my world tilting off its axis. What if they fired me? What if the police got involved? This nightmare was worse than any gossip or catty comment. But then Noah spoke up, his voice firm. "She didn't do this," he stated. "I know her." Hearing him defend me so publicly, without a shred of doubt, nearly brought me to tears. He refused to let them bully me and started calling for an internal investigation, suspecting that someone had staged the whole thing. I realized in that moment that trust goes both ways. He was putting his own credibility on the line to save mine. And I knew right then that I'd do the same for him in a heartbeat. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Noah spearheaded a deeper investigation, pulling security footage from every corner of the building. Turns out the cameras caught my coworkers sneaking the items into my locker. They'd been sloppy, clearly not expecting the CEO to take such a personal interest. When the evidence was laid bare, the thieves had no choice but to confess. The board and the HR department, suddenly seeing how loyal Noah was to me, tried to backpedal. They apologized for the accusations, though it felt more like they were covering their own, but then showing genuine remorse. Noah was furious. He openly criticized the company's internal processes for letting something like this happen. And in a dramatic move, he threatened to resign if they didn't drop all charges and issue me a formal apology. I was stunned. This man was ready to walk away from the empire he'd helped build, all because I was framed. It didn't just shut the gossip down, it obliterated it. People realized that Noah wasn't going to abandon me and that I wasn't some cunning trickster. Under pressure, the board caved. They not only cleared my name but also turned over any disciplinary actions to the actual culprits. Some resigned in disgrace, while others tried to salvage whatever was left of their careers. As for Noah, he stood by me every step of the way, ensuring I didn't get chewed up by the bureaucracy. The public statement from the company was simple, but got the job done. I was innocent, and the matter was resolved. The sting of betrayal lingered, but it also felt liberating to finally be proven truthful. Standing next to Noah at that final meeting, I realized how far we'd come. We weren't just boss and employee anymore. We were partners in a sense. And that bond was stronger than any rumor. With the scandal behind us, life started to brighten. Avery fully recovered, thanks to proper medical care and the reduced stress he sensed from me. We found a slightly bigger apartment, not fancy, but cozy enough for us to carve out a real home. Noah insisted on helping with some of the financial load, but we did it in a way that let me keep my pride. He'd pay for Avery's educational extras, while I covered our day-to-day expenses with my salary. It was a compromise that worked for both of us. Noah's grandparents, seeing how determined he was, finally backed down. They might not have been thrilled about my background or our relationship, but they saw that threatening him only pushed him further away. And at the end of the day, they cared about Noah's happiness more than they cared about their own rigid ideals, though I suspect it was a tough pill for them to swallow. Back at work, people eventually found new things to gossip about. A few coworkers apologized for misjudging me, and some friendships even sprouted. The board moved on to the next business challenge, and it seemed the dust had settled. Meanwhile, Noah and I kept building what we'd started. We were still learning about each other, our quirks, our past traumas, our hopes for the future. But that was part of the journey. Then, one afternoon, Noah invited Avery and me to a family gathering at his grandparents' estate. It was awkward at first, but Avery broke the ice by just being his goofy self. By the end of the day, there were cautious smiles all around. It wasn't a perfect happy ending, but it was a hopeful beginning. Later that evening, as Noah and I stood on the veranda, overlooking the sprawling gardens, he took my hand and asked if I'd share my life with him. This time, there was no panic or confusion, just the warmth of genuine love. I said yes, tears in my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like life was finally on the upswing. We'd fallen hard, but we were rising together, stronger than ever.